Hello, everyone. It's a great that we can all join together tonight for one of our meeting for the series where we study spiritism connection with human psychology. In these studies, we bring together the teachings of Allan Kardec and Joanna de Angelis. I'm Fabrício Assunção from the Spiritist Society of Bournemouth in England. I'm pleased to welcome and introduce to you tonight's speakers. They are Alexandre Fontoura dos Santos and Michele Ponzono dos Santos from the Brazilian Spiritist Medical Association. Alexandre and Michele will give their talk in Portuguese, so we are pleased to welcome Dr. Dana Sissi from the Spiritist Institute in the United States of America, who will be giving us simultaneous translation into English. Alexandre, Michel, and Dan each have a distinguished background in Spiritist study, so let me say a few words of introduction. Alexandre is a psychologist, historian, and teacher. He is professor of the Spiritist Psychology of Joana de Angelis, a member of the Medical Spiritist Association of Rio Grande do Sul, and he is also an analyst in training at the Jungian Institute of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Michelle is a psychologist, a psychoanalyst, and a Jungian analyst. She's a member of the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil and the Jungian Institute of Rio Grande do Sul, and she is a teacher of Joanna de Angelis courses. Ben Assis has a doctorate in education. He is the founding member of the Spiritist Institute in the United States. He is an author and gives many public talks on spirituality and spiritism internationally. Our viewers' microphones will be on mute. Will be recorded tonight for our study. Our theme for tonight's study is pain, suffering, and plenitude, overcoming suffering. It refers to part 4 for the Spirit's book by Allan Kardec, chapters 1 and 2, earthly joys and sorrows, and future joys and sorrows. Now, let me hand it over to tonight's guest speakers, to Alexandre and Michelle, and then over to you guys.
Ok. Então, boa noite a todos. É um grande prazer.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here
Conhecidos já nossos. E dando continuidade
so that we can continue to reflect
fazer as reflexões e conectando os
on the
nossos
teachings of Allan Kardec
Allan Kardec, a psicologia.
and Joanna de Angelis' Spiritist Psychology.
Hoje nós vamos
Today,
falar sobre o sofrimento,
we'll talk about pain, suffering, and plenitude,
que o espiritismo
and what
pode
Spiritism
dizer a respeito
can tell
da
us
liberação do sofrimento.
about that. And hello to all of you who are here. Thank you for being here and paying attention to this maths of sort that relates to this greatest equation on earth, our identity, our history, our story, and the way in which we interpret the happenings in life and in the world. Happiness, sadness, pleasure are all terms and topics that are present in all philosophies, in all religions, in all times in our history.
E na quarta parte,
And in the fourth part of the Spirit's book, we'll have some information around suffering, about plenitude, or as it says, the hopes and solaces on earth and in the future.
na conclusão dessa parte, Santo Agostinho,
In the conclusion of that part, St. Augustine
não traz uma
brings to us the idea that Spiritism is not bringing a different moral ethics than that of Jesus. It brings the same one, that of universal charity. The spirits have come to confirm that and to show us its practical use, its practical utility, and help us understand these truths. And especially with these ethics, it helps us define these most abstract problems of psychology. Kardec tells us that Spiritism is the most terrible antagonist to materialism, that with fact, Spiritism kills materialism. And even if it's just that, which would be great, but it goes beyond. it talks to us about the effects of evil, the benefits of doing good. And because of it, many people have been able to improve their feelings, neutralize some of their shortcomings, and moving away from what sometimes we call evil. And that's because the future has stopped being something imprecise. It is now possible for us to see and hear from the spirits as they tell us how life is on the other side. We used to say, nobody has come to tell us about what life is on the other side. But in Spiritism, we see that happen all the time. We see spirits regret or be happy for what they have done on earth. And there is that other wonderful book called Heaven and Hell that touches upon these messages from the great beyond. And also want to remind you that the fourth work of Kardec, Heaven and Hell, can also be understood as a psychological treatise on the state of the soul. Because we'll see kings, queens, princesses, slaves, people like us, all kinds of people, and who have their lives in the world guided by their own point of view and how to relate people. Sometimes with a greater clarity, sometimes perhaps touched more by their self-interest. And in that book, we see the results of that and in which condition these spirits find themselves in the spiritual world. And we want to highlight this idea of condition in the spiritual realm, because that is a way to achieve a feedback for ourselves about our souls. Because we have ways of thinking and ways of behaving that produce a energy or vibratory impact on how we register our emotions, our thoughts, and attitudes. Energies that can be destructive, energies that can be positive. And in that, we find ourselves learning how to choose better. And if there's something very powerful that the spirits can bring us from the other side and seeing the world, it is the quality of this, our inner life, of course, which has a lot to do with the idea of pain, pleasure, and plenitude. The spirit Joanna de Angelis has a wonderful book called Plenitude, in which she draws a study around suffering. In it, she starts by telling us that suffering is part of life, especially in the evolutionary stage in which we find ourselves in this world of trials and expiations, which in itself is moving towards a world of regeneration. Suffering is a mechanism of nature through which progress, whether it's intellectual or moral, takes place. To free ourselves from suffering and reach happiness and plenitude is the goal that all of us aim for. When this happiness is only tied to the transitory pleasures of the world in a sort of hedonistic mode, and this attachment to materialism, we are fated to be frustrated because these things are temporary, and when they go, they pass, we suffer. So, in this unending search for pleasure, we transfer ourselves from one sensation to another without understanding that it may create this unbalance that creates suffering in us. Our unbridled ambition for things sometimes does not satisfy us. We are not happy with what we have. We always want to make more. How many people, for instance, stop working in what they like to have another job in which they make more money? Or our hobbies that sometimes never fulfill us, but instead leave us with a certain frustration, because this hunger that the physical world has can be satiated in the moment, but later it goes away. Even with our own food, we can see this. Sometimes we eat in that moment,
na contenção
we're not
espiritual da
sated.
mesma maneira,
Sexually, we
né?
can also make the
Claro
same
que não
bridge.
dá para
We're not
dizer
sated when we
que
indulge in so much of it. And
dinheiro,
when we're
nós
searching for
vemos
money
pessoas que têm sonhos
and
consideráveis,
means and social position and
habilidades,
fame and
planos,
intelligence, and
inteligência,
they travel to where they
viagem,
want
por
to,
prazer,
they buy what they want to, they relate to
se
many
relacionam
different
com
people,
diversas
and
pessoas
yet
e se
they still
sentem
feel
atormentados pelo
challenged
tédio,
and tormented by emptiness, by boredom, by
também
dissatisfaction,
nesses quadros
which also
psicológicos.
cause suffering.
E acham muitas vezes
And they also think that
que seu prazer
suffering
está em qualquer
is
coisa no
everywhere
externo,
in the outside world,
conforme conseguem ou não
whether
usufruir
they're able to enjoy that which they want. But
mas
it's
não
deeper than that.
entendem que se
And it has to
torna
do with our inner world,
inferno
our
a
intimate
nossa vida
life
íntima,
inside.
quando não há real
When we don't find that
significado.
inner meaning,
Aquelas
these
conquistas
outwardly
materiais e
achievements, which are
espirituais
transitory,
perdem o seu
they lose their meaning
significado.
shortly after they are arrived at.
Nisso reside a
And
maior
this
das
yields a great
frustrações
amount of
e
frustrations and
frustrações que
dissatisfactions that
causam
cause
suffering.
suffering. We can also pause here, Michelle, to pay attention to something so that we don't fall into the trap of being moralistic. There were times in which religions condemned every single way of pleasure. There was even a certain castration in the beginning of the 20th century that Freud spoke about as being cause of neurosis. And now we live different times where we talked about liberation, especially when we talk about sexual pleasures. And we continue to be as neurotic, full of neurosis as we were before. So the answer is not on the prohibition and not in the complete abuse. Or when we talked about Zygmunt Bauman and the liquid times, and everything is allowed and everything is permitted, which may lead it to lose its meaning. So for us to escape this moralistic approach, which will be a little hypocritical, we want to think, we want to say that we do not want to say that the physical pleasures don't have meaning. Did you think that I could be able to do this talk if I didn't drink a little coffee beforehand? Here in Brazil, sometimes we can't do this without the air conditioning because we're during summer. And that brings us pleasure in the sense of well-being. But the great question is not that these things don't have value. Of course, pleasures and satisfactions do have value. How wonderful it would be for us to have momentary pleasure and that stay with us in our soul. And that is the question. Sometimes these fleeting moments don't have staying power. It goes quickly, and it's a natural part of pleasures and moral suffering and moral enjoyment. But the really important thing is that the pleasure of the soul that stays is this moral transformation. It is how we move through between riches and poorness. Of course, we'll have a certain pleasure and certain pain, but let not us be slaves of these pleasures. Let's imagine a king in a fairy tale who is surrounded by subjects only enjoying physical pleasures. Does that work? No. How can I say that so full of conviction? Because if there's something that has been tested in our humanity, is the idea that we want to lose weight by eating chocolate. You can try. If it works, then let me know, because I want to know. But traditionally, that doesn't work. But just as it is important for us to have the pleasure, it's important for us to know how to contain that. And these two approaches enrichen ourselves. Just eating and not eating are not helpful. And so if we go back to these kings, and everybody wants to be a king and queen, that's a symbol for us to talk about. Everybody wants to be adored and appreciated, and to get in touch with multiple opportunities to have pleasures in the physical world. It's not that that is wrong, But if we stay only in that, we have a soul who has an inner world and a capacity, such as Andrea Lewis tells us, uh, an electrical capability, so to say, in the world of vibrations and perception of vibrations. So if we are not aware of this inner world, they become poor in spirit in the sense that they lack that opportunity. People who only have physical pleasures, they become vulnerable to different things. And that is part of the problems with social media, video games, which is this compulsion for enjoyment that the young people feel. But also, not just the young people, but those of us who are a little bit older, which is this addiction to this electronic media. And if they are become more intolerant to frustration, what a dangerous trap. The more we search pleasure blindly, the more displeasure we end up at. So it's not a question of being moralistic to judge what is good and what's bad for other people, but to learn how to live. Because Spiritism helps us to identify ourselves as spirits, as not as matter, and that we are here in matter with a purpose. And this helps us to better dialogue with these different forces of life. And we're going to come back to this point in a little bit.
Não, eu acho
I like the
perfeito,
way
Alexandre,
you
sua
have put
fala.
this,
E o
Alexander,
que engaja
and
mais
continuing
ainda
on this line of thought.
na maioria das
In
vezes,
many
nós
ways, we are very
buscamos
immediate.
e nos
We
interessamos
want the
muito
things today without worrying
pelas
about what's
questões
coming
da
later.
dor. E
And what the
muitas
spirit, Joanna
vezes
the
me
Angelus,
parece
tells us
também
is that
que
suffering or
nós
pain is not
pensamos
punishment,
isso é
it is a
tudo na
mechanism
vida,
of life in
isso é
service of life.
sofrimento. Mas muitas
But
vezes
many
nós,
times
quando nos
we are left
questionamos por que que os
ourselves
bons
questioning,
sofrem,
why do good people suffer?
simplesmente
Why
porque
are
as
so many things different
adversidades
right now in the
do
world? We
mundo
have climate
nos
change, we have
frustram,
wars, we have all different
porque as
kinds of things.
pessoas se
And many
mostram
people
pessoas tão
revolt.
boas, né? Tem tanta
There's so many
gente
wonderful people doing good
que se
things.
mostra
Why do the good
muito
people
e os
suffer?
bons sofrem. E o
And
espiritismo,
Spiritism
ele nos ensina
helps
imensamente
us to
sobre
understand
isso.
that. Spiritism tells us
Diz que as
that
pessoas
sincere people that work
sinceras,
for
que fazem o
goodness
bem,
are
bons
those who,
é
in the
porque no
past,
passado
also
fizeram
leverage
mal
evil to improve their conditions.
e
And
voltaram
they are
para a
reborn with a
correção
predisposition
do
to doing
mal.
good.
Isso é o que a gente vai
And this is
ver
what we'll find in
mais à
Kardec's
frente.
writings.
Mas a
But this
disposição
predisposition
não nos dá
does not
felicidade.
automatically entitle us to be happy.
Eu
I
desejo
wish to be
bons,
good, to be
mas
kind, to be
esse
just,
desejo,
but this
esse
desire
desejo, ele
is
não
not able to
vai
simply
fazer
make it
uma
happen
mudança.
that we change
Isso não
ourselves.
vai
These are internal
mudar.
values that we need to
Isso vai
develop.
desenvolver.
And as that
Enquanto isso, as
still
doenças
weighs on
progressam
us based on what we
no
have done in the
passado.
past.
Então é por isso que nós
That is
ouvimos
because we see a lot in our mediumistic
muitos
work the spirits
espíritos
who sometimes we call the obsessing spirits that tell us,
dizendo:
I
ah,
have found the person
aconteceu a pessoa essa e
who in the
fulana no
past
passado
killed me or my
fizeram
family and now they are
isso,
disguised, but I
aquilo,
find them, but I will
e eu vou
achieve revenge.
vingar. E aí
And then the person who is in charge of the dialoguing with the spirit explains, but yes, my friend,
meu amigo, mas
I
eu
would
até acho que eu devia te
feel like you have,
conhecer
but there is a
naquele
moment
momento.
to
E
think
não,
about you in this moment.
vamos pensar em ti.
Because the
E o
spirits,
espírito
many
muitas
times,
vezes
they are
ele
right.
tem razão. Eu
I
escutei
heard
o
Divaldo
Divaldo
Franco
Franco
tell a
contar
story once
a respeito de um
about
médico norte-americano abortista
a American
que
doctor
tentou
who proposed
engravidar.
abortion.
Foi um
Maybe
médico
you
muito
heard him hear
famoso
that.
na
And he had
época.
practiced many
Ele
abortions.
tinha
He had many
3.000
clinics, ended up being very
testemunhas.
wealthy.
Mas
But it turned
aconteceu,
out
ele
that in the
estava
middle of a
durante o
procedure,
procedimento,
the
o
fetus
feto agarrou
grabbed his
no
hand,
dedo.
and that
E
touched his
aquilo foi
soul in
tão
such a way that he changed from that
mudou aquela
experience. He
experiência,
began to rethink
repensar seus
his
valores.
values,
E ele
and he
começou a
started to
reconhecer
go
o
on
valor
campaigns
do
against abortion.
aborto. Mas será que
But
isso
is that
move
enough
os
and overcome for the thousands of
psicoterapeutas?
abortions he's done before? if we were the aborted fetus, will we forgive him
E as tantas
and the women who underwent these procedures
fizeram aborto e muitas vezes
and
se
and
arrependem
regret,
e tem a chamada
and they have the
síndrome do
so-called
pós-aborto,
post-abortion syndrome?
só porque se
So how
arrependeu,
does regret play into that? And what Divaldo Franco explains to us
é que nós
is
devemos
that we
pensar sim,
have to be responsible for those actions. It's not that they're a debt, but is a reimbursement, so to say, to the universe. We have to offer
recursos
resources for rehabilitation.
em cada
So
desses.
in a
Quais
case
seriam
such like this,
ali,
how can we rehabilitate ourselves
de tantas
of somebody who
dores,
caused perhaps many deaths,
traumas,
many
e esse
traumas? How can he
caminho
make up for this?
e ele dá como
And he
exemplo
continues to share
que esse homem
that
poderia
this
ter sido
man could perhaps be reborn as a chief of state or in a mission to save lives, or perhaps find the cure for illnesses and save thousands of lives through their own sacrifice.
e aí
And so this responsibility decreases.
e
And
quanto
how many
nós
of us
carregamos
take with us moral debts
morais,
before our consciousness and the cosmic consciousness,
lógica, e que nós temos sempre
and in which we have the conditions to repair them?
então não
So
é
it's not that we are
recuperação
demanding
através desses investimentos,
recuperation,
né?
it's
Você
about
ouviu, Alexandre,
overcoming this. And I don't know, Alexandre, if you have heard this story and many others in which Spiritism helps us understand cause and effect. Yes, Michel, that which you're speaking of has a lot to do with what Kardec brings us in the idea of action and reaction. Kardec has, for instance, taken this knowledge that has been throughout our human history for thousands of years, and he's bringing that to us with the clothing of science, so to speak, in that moment of the 19th century. So we're not just talking only about what's good and what's bad, but we're talking about a law of cause and consequence, of action and reaction. The scientific movement that exists in our consciousness. And we understand that life is not destined only to pleasure and not only to suffering. There's pleasure and there's suffering as mechanisms for evolution. Love is perhaps the greatest feeling in human nature, and it empowers us towards the progression of our spirits. But it's also natural that in a world that's still very physical, like Earth, that if it were to place in a scale of development, it's still on the bottom rung. We know goodness and we feel it, but it does not predominate everything. Self-interest and desire to predominate over others is still the majority. Our instincts still govern over our consciousness and not the other way around. So it's understandable that we're still a little bit lost when it comes to love and suffering. And so at this level, our evolutionary scale, suffering has a very important role in our development. It helps us understand what is right and what is wrong. Would it be good to get a pair of scissors and stick it in a power plug? No, I don't know. Let me try it. And I'll tell you what is the result, if it was good or not. Of course, you will know a little bit what the result of that experiment will be. So here we test, and based on my experience, I will begin to internalize to what degree that helps me or does not serve me. So our state of, so still at a juvenile level, suffering will help us to change our perspectives that oftentimes will go unnoticed. And it will be, it remains unconscious to our development. So Gianna de Angelis brings us a position that is really interesting. That pain and suffering are mechanisms for our evolution. When we don't have the resources of love, when we don't live the resources of love, that's what happens. There's even a very famous sentence that we say in Brazil that is often said in spiritist groups. If we don't evolve through love, we will evolve through pain. Although it's very common, but it makes sense. So we have a little bit of both. In this world in which matter still dominates, everything that represents pain or pleasure is very obvious to us, and we want to avoid pain at all costs, and we want to seek pleasure at all points. We're still very identified with our physical bodies and the sensations. So Joanna de Angelis gets a quote from Kardec that suffering has a lot to do with our identification with our body. We have this fantasy that whatever it is that's good for our body is good for our souls, and that it's not always true. Sometimes we may be going through a very delicate moment physically, but we are learning to forgive, we're learning to love, we're learning to be more patient and forgiving, and developing our inner life and reflection, and know that even though things on the outside world may not be working the way we want to, we are growing. So Joanna de Angelis will tell us that the more important piece is the emotional perspective of the spirit. And she says that a brute or a barbarian spirit, so to say, will transform all its pain, suffering, and frustration into a savage or wild response, or be more aggressive, much the same way that the world imposed on it. I have the need to deal with this by hurting the world. It's a catharsis, but it's not a therapeutic one. It's one that increases my suffering. While she says that the saint or the aesthete, two words that she has chosen to those who have a little bit more consciousness, she says that the saint will transform its suffering in a proposal for liberation and happiness to other people. And so we don't need to go very far from that. Look at how many people, because they were persecuted before, they were hurt before, they're able to develop the ability to understand others, as if they were to say, you're doing something wrong. I've been in your shoes before. And from that moment, I can see how difficult it is for you. And because I went through something similar to that which you're living, maybe it's not exactly what you're living, but similar, I have empathy for you. I have a compassion for you. Even if you're right, I'm not interested in winning this argument, but to help you and help you develop this understanding in a different perspective. We can see that the pain that we suffer can be something for the same. We have very historical names. For instance, Gandhi transformed persecution in a movement of peace and love for the persecutors. He used to say that the Indians who were colonized by the English, they were poor, they were going through difficult moments, but they were in a superior condition over those who had everything material. Of course, there's a lot of different things that helped them find freedom for India and from colonization, but he brought a great perspective. Mandela, for instance, is arrested, and for more than 20 years, he remains in prison, especially because his political enemies killed his son and many people around him. But he shares with us that he undergoes a transformation, and that it was very important for him to be in that state because it helped him tame that inner beast. And when he leaves prison, he comes with a very humanistic approach that to end apartheid, the victims would need to value the aggressor. And look how dangerous and difficult that is. To understand the values of the white people in that moment, to give an example of comprehension so that they can do some healing. Because if they were to be half on the way, it's the same way, would only create another problem. And we can see here there's an inversion here. Even the psychologist Viktor Frankl from Vienna, from Austria, he goes through concentration camps. And different from the psychology of Freud and Jung, who are born in laboratory and clinics, with all credit, Viktor Frankl's psychology was born from somebody who was slaved in the concentration camp, fighting for his own life. the the Nazi took him the books that he had written, took him his parents away from him, the pregnant wife who was also killed by them, and he realized that if he did not forgive them, it didn't extract value from that, he would not have meaning in his life. And so he makes from those difficult moments a deep dive into the shadows to bring a proposal for human liberation. Of course, this historical name seems sometimes out of touch from our possibilities, but this transformation happens every day in our lives when we change shadow into light. And another important detail, Michelle, is that when it comes to deep psychology, do you know that pain and suffering are not the same thing? Pain is a more of an instantaneous reaction. Somebody steps into your foot and you're going to react. There's not a lot of choice in feeling that pain. And suffering is how I see that pain, how I deal with that pain. So much so that in deep psychology, the trauma is not what has happened to me, but how I deal and read that which has happened to me in the past. And it goes beyond that. The trauma has a lot to do with how I deal with life now, how I choose to live, how I choose to face the challenges that I now face. It's how I am transforming that which has happened to me in the relation to the world and life, which really matches perfectly with the spirits bring us. The enlightened spirits, they have gone through unfathomable situations to different situations. But why is it that to be an enlightened spirit, we have to go through such hardship? Truth is that we all go through that, and they are not exempted from that either. So the psychological proposal for Joanna and Kardec is the development of this idea to liberate ourselves from suffering by understanding our life on earth, which is meant to transform our capabilities from a spiritual perspective. When we understand that the world is here to help us transform ourselves because we're not here to stay, we'll begin little by little to dialogue with these two different things of pain and pleasure that will always be present here in material life. And we will succeed more often than not to find a relative happiness, not only the balance of our external life, of course, but also with this balance of our inner life and how we accept the world. And I'd like to add something else that Joanna de Angelis brings to us is that suffering is not imposed by God. Suffering is created by each one of us, especially because its intensity and its duration are also directly connected to our evolutionary scale, our moral resistance fiber, so to speak, and basically our evolutionary stage. And one thing that she tells us about quite often is that running away or seeking to bury that is inefficient. They are mechanisms that only delay the reality and ends up adding even challenges because we end up losing time in dealing with those pains and looking at our own hurt. So one of the things she helps us to reflect on is how we should not postpone this investigation. There's many people in the Spiritist movement, for instance, that say, I'm going to leave that to the next incarnation. That is really hard to deal with that person. I'm going to leave that for my next life. But what Joanna brings to us is that we shouldn't postpone that. That often this could take many centuries until it's possible for us to create the conditions that are necessary for the people in that particular way so that we can restore those relationships. One of these such examples is in the story of the book 2000 Years Ago. by the Spirit Emmanuel through the mediumship of Francis Xavier. We see a scene of Publio Lentulus, the main character, and he meets Jesus, and he can take advantage of that moment, leaving his ego aside, and take this on, but he's not able to. And in the next book, also brought by Francis Xavier, 50 years later, the name of the book, we'll see that that spirit takes more than 1,000 years to go back to the same place where he was when he missed the opportunity to be before Jesus. So sometimes when we say like, I'm going to leave that for later, but when is that later? Is it 1,000 years from now? How many lifetimes from now will we be able to be in a circumstance that is favorable for us to tackle the challenges and heal the relationships and the debts that we have? Now, it doesn't mean that we must submit ourselves to abusive relationships or situations at home to achieve this peace. We have lots of studies that tell us that it's important for us to understand that a separation is a good thing, so that that challenge doesn't escalate. But let us do our best in terms of loving to be able to face ourselves and leverage that moment so that we can heal suffering at its roots, to be able to be courageous in examining these situations, because this therapeutic effect that we get, the peace, it's a really powerful one. And on the opposite side, this feeling of anger and ire trigger these feelings and even create even more dissatisfaction. There's an expression that Joanna de Angelis uses often. She says it's dynamic resignation. That is, we should start to feel this resignation that is in an active way. It's the acceptance of the problem with an attitude that is brave in facing it and removing its causes. According to her, that is a very advanced step to solving the issue at hand. So, to know ourselves as immortal spirits that are in an evolutionary process, that have many different reincarnatory experiences, this will help us and strengthen us in overcoming our suffering, which is part of our lives. What do you think about that, Alexandre? That has a lot to do with good and evil and suffering. And for us to know the two different sides of the spectrum. And perhaps as the Eastern traditions tell us about the yin and the yang, like two sides of the coin. So sometimes we have a great ability to things make more complicated. Sometimes we know that we need that resignation, but we have to also apply effort to wake up. So for instance, imagine a student in a difficult test. To be in resignation is accepting that you have to do this test and you're going to do your best during this exam. There's a very interesting book that's very interesting. The first book that Divaldo psychographed from Joana de Angelis says Letters of Love, Message Amor. And many of these messages in this book, they were psychographed by Divaldo in moments in which Divaldo was suffering. And these messages recentered him, but also incentivize him to look at different ways. So she brings a sense of discipline and saying, wake up to life, and also empower him to move forward. In one of these messages, she says, you're suffering, but you're not a victim. Your pain is not the pain of punishment. It's the pain of transformation. It's the pain of reparation, of renewal, renewing pain. It's a moment of a transformation of perspectives. It's a change. So she is really trying to get him from being frozen by pain or fear because sometimes we don't want to feel any pain and we pretend not to feel it, or because we accept that we feel it and we don't want to get out of bed. So I want to go back a little bit, Michelle. This idea about identification with our physical bodies and matter. We also use the author Andrew Lewis a lot, and perhaps you may not have been exposed to the books of Andrew Lewis, The Spirit, through the mediumship of Francis Xavier, but it's a series of books that is really deep and really helpful. And in one of these books, Nosso Lar, Our Home, when he is reflecting on his experience in which he felt defeated, he dies on Earth as a scientist, a doctor on Earth that was lauded and famous to a certain extent. He was prideful, received many honors, he was respected but also feared. But in the spiritual world, he felt himself in a very opposite situation. So the problem was that he lived a lot his external character, but internally he did not work on his patience and his tolerance and his frustrations. His faith and spirituality had already crystallized in some way. He was a prideful man, and the more he obtained fame in science, he allowed himself certain excuses, like being arrogant. Oh, I'm famous. People have to get used to me and my habits. So, in the spiritual world, he finds himself in what we call the lower zones. These pains, this zones of pain and suffering. It has nothing to do with hell, friends, because there is no hell. It doesn't really match our spiritual perspectives. But there are places in the spiritual realms, there are transitory places where spirits come together by affinity in ways of thinking and behaving. And if it's a negative way of thinking and behaving, then there's lots of suffering. He found himself in this negative experience. That's part of our human psyche. And as he was wandering through these difficult zones, he begins to reflect. And he thinks about how he has lived. And as he opens himself to reflection and prayer, he will begin to notice his arrogance, his pride, people, things that people did not challenge him on, and that he did not want to be challenged on. As he progresses in this reflection, he says, I did not create organs for the spiritual life. Of course, he's not talking about organs in the physical body. He's using the symbol to say that he did not have an inner life, that he had not faced the great questions of the soul within himself. He had not spent time dealing with his ethical, moral questions as much as he needed. And then he said, I was like a flower in a greenhouse. And what is that? Is a term that we can say that somebody which is living in ideal conditions. But when they are in a different set of conditions, we can see that they might struggle to grow. In the spiritual world, he had connected with arrogant spirits, with spirits addicted to alcohol, and perhaps a not balanced sexuality. And that's in the vibratory range he felt himself in the spiritual world. And as his sensitivity improves, he begins to feel the vibrations that come from himself and that create suffering. Perhaps the sensitive mediums can attest to that. They may have anger and a bout of frustration at home, like all of us do. Sometimes the kids challenge us. But if we let that overtake us, that anger, that ire, the people who are more sensitive and have that aspect of mediumship, they will find this vibratory impact a little bit more severely. And sometimes we don't even realize what are we causing in other people and how we're taking things in. But if the medium has a little bit more of a self-reflection practice, they'll be able to deal that. And how about the spirits who discarnate? They feel that to an even greater extent. And that's what happened to André Luiz. And his journey is a very beautiful one. And in a way, reflects that of all of us because he begins to realize the values that he left behind. And he will begin to gather this ability to understand the other, to see the contradictions on earth, the dramas that he lived through, and see that differently. And he will find a different wisdom and derive some pleasure from that. Because as he goes through his journey, as we see in the many great religious texts, the great transformations of the soul are in his moments of reflection, of prayer, of reflection in the desert. We see Moses in the mount or in the burning bush, these transcendental moments. But also, it's important for us to value the moments of great pain and suffering. They're not only the great, wonderful moments. Buddha, for instance, in his journey, he didn't find his pleasure just in meditation and compassion and this overcoming of the world of appearances. It was very important in his soul, that suffering, that sensibility and sensitivity he had, emotionally speaking, when he came in contact with pain and death that he did not know. He had had a sheltered life, raised in a palace, raised by a loving father that isolated him from the world. And when he had public contact with the world, he saw an old man. And later he saw people who were dying, and he had not seen that. And according to the story, he didn't even know what old people were. And he was even afraid. But he was touched deeply in his emotions. He suffered because he had empathy. He suffered because he wanted to see those people better. And that's where his journey starts. And so there's a great transformation, a treasure that we find in the pain, but that is necessary for us to be aware of it, to be able to go in this path, which is also a path of happiness and fulfillment, but that comes from being willing to build this journey. And look at what Joanna also brings us. Love is the great and most efficient antidote to suffering. That which you talked about before, the relation between suffering and love. When one moves away, the other one approaches. She says that they're interdependent, that there are mechanisms of evolution. When we don't have one, the other one shows up. And sometimes they appear together. And so when it comes to liberation from suffering, she says that she tells us that that happens when we empty ourselves from ambition, when we can bring this sense of abnegation, overcoming our most immediate desires. And Joanna de Angelis tells us that integral health, inner happiness, is a result of a mental lucidity that is able to see the right acts for living a life that will then grow. And of course, traditional therapies can certainly help us recover our health and our maintenance of health, but it is only our inner factors that really are responsible for our emotional and social behavior can create permanent conditions for our well-being and really, truly free us from the causes of suffering, allowing us to bring this sense of well-being and balance. Jesus synthesized in love this great power for the nullification of these unhappy moments and for us to be able to overcome suffering with goodness. And Allan Kardec, through the study of these lessons from the gospel and of many contributions that the enlightened spirits brought him, he will talk about charity being a way in which we can grow, of so-called salvation that leads us to inner health, because charity is the expression of love in its most noble expression. The practice of helping others even affects in the modeling of our spiritual body, the spiritual body that we have, and being able to correct damage to our spiritual body. So the expression of love, of service to others, has the ability to restore our health little by little. So all of us that are going through this journey here on earth, trying to overcome our pains, let's keep that in mind, that the pain that we go through today, that was built in a difficult and a distant past. We planted the seeds and now we reap the fruits. Very well. So let's start the harvest now for that which we want. Sorry, let's start to sow now what we want to harvest in the future. People say, well, I work really hard, I do all these grand things, but I'm always suffering, being hard. How can that happen? Well, but there's a time between one and the other. We need to sow good acts. We need nature to take its course and for these plants to germinate and grow. And in the future, we'll be able to harvest that and reap these rewards. Of course, we also need to bear in mind that we don't have it very clearly here on earth what kind of attitudes we had in the past. Like we forget our previous lives, the spirits tell us, because in our evolutionary level, we would not be able to handle to a great extent that which we have lived and done in past lives. Whether they were bad things, perhaps we couldn't withstand the crimes that we have perpetrated. And maybe we'd not be able to deal with the people who now we love, but in the past, maybe we're not. And even our successes too, they could also be a problem, because we could perhaps attach ourselves to things we've done in the past and would not incentivize for us to move forward. Much the same way that we think, how will I be a student in college, in our university, if all of a sudden I was a scientist like Michael Faraday? I've already studied that in the past. Why do I have to study that again? I've already done these things. Why do I need to do that again? I'd rather play video game and be happier. So it could de-incentivize our behavior. Or perhaps I can never achieve the level that I've reached before. Our vanity and our pride could kick in. So even that which is good in our past could be misunderstood for us now, and we may not have the emotional ability to deal with that right now. Of course, there are people in their mediumistic abilities have even the experience of having spontaneous lifetime reflections where it comes back to them. Sometimes that's a problem too, creates a challenge. Even if these are welcome memories, sometimes they have to process that so that they don't confuse that from the reality. So you can't treat a son as your great-grandfather. And now I had to deal with my son in ways that I dealt with them. So, so do we really know if they were indeed the same person? Because there's a lot of fantasy out there. But even if you were, sometimes we're sabotaging a different experience because that child is not in the same place that he was before. So it's important for us to be very careful about it. And we also should try to understand the following: that life on earth that doesn't have its dose of pain and suffering doesn't have much value. How are we going to be born in this country, in this planet, to grow and not face challenges? We won't be able to find our frailties and the desire to work. And this need for our own evolutionary progress is very important. You know that deep psychology, as Jungian psychology, that Joanna DeAngelis cites often, it is more connected not in the origin of pain, but where that points us to in this world. That is, if I have a depression, if I'm developing depression today because I lost my job, or perhaps I wasn't well tended to when I was a child, all that is part of life. That's what we call the etiological factor, the creating factor that creates the problem, the illness, the disturbance. Of course, that has a value, but for deep psychology, that which has more value is that where is that pointing you to? If you're developing depression, it is also putting brakes on my piece so that I can rescue within myself something that is lost. And why is it important for me to go and restore that? Because there is a better version of me that wants to live, and I need to rescue that which is missing. There is a configuration, a version of Alexandre, of Daniel, of Fabricio, of Michele that is more sophisticated, that is within the possibilities of my spirit to reach. And unconsciously, I have the desire to arrive at. But for that to happen, I need to change some things. And the spirit then develops a certain sense of depression. We don't have depression just because things are not going well, but because also there is some goodness to be lived. And that has a lot to connect with what spirits bring to us through Kardec. Because the goal of evolution is this pure spirit state. We are in this physical world that will arrive, and we will arrive at a point where we will begin to evolve more independently than just through reincarnations. Until I get to a point in which my spirit does not need to incarnate anymore and my life is fully spiritual. And whoever gets to that stage, that's what we call pure spirits, in which old languages, perhaps we call them angels, the more mythological language. But these are the spirits who have worked to a certain extent. And in Buddhism, it's called about enlightenment. So it kind of connects to everything that the spirits bring. Of course, this won't happen overnight. We're talking about enlightenment that happens through an insight and so forth. But we can talk about a moment into which we no longer have a need to reincarnate. So many times that which we talk about, this rescue, this restoring from something we bring from previous lives, is not just if something was good or bad that I need to review it, but it's that I have a pure spirit dormant in me, and it leads me to reflect with that. It's a thirst to fulfill myself to my greatest potential. And much the same way, the instinct of the body leads us to hunger, desire. The instinct also takes us to many wonderful things. There's also an instinct of the soul, so to speak. We're going to borrow the word instinct here to say that there's one in the soul. To love and forgive is an instinct of the soul. Souls who have been hurt, they can seek revenge, they can hate. And it's even understandable that may happen. And that's part of your free will. But naturally, our souls go into suffering because in our the unconscious, they have a need for love and forgiveness. And we can say, yes, there's people that have to go really, really deep. It's hard to see. But all dictators, all murderers, all arrogant people, or vain or prideful people, deep down inside, they have a need, a demanding need to feel the great sensations and emotions and feelings that love brings to the soul. They're just not aware of that. And if we know that, sometimes we don't know how to achieve these things. That is why we have so many incarnations, which are different chances for us to start again, or to repair that which we did not do well, or to continue to develop and elaborate in different ways that which we had already working on in a good way. That's why reincarnation, according to the spirits, is a natural law that connects to divine justice, that connects to reason, that in different ways will be contradictory. So reincarnation would allow us to achieve in many different ways through many lives. And so that which is pain, which is suffering, begins to dilute, which is hard for us to interpret. And we'll begin to see these different things. Also, because we should not judge ourselves for seeking pleasure, but the pleasure of the soul is more important. And for instance, right now I need to reach the remote control of the air conditioning here because I need to make it cooler because it's really hot. As we were talking about Kardec and Joanna, we feel this human warmth, and the warmth in our heart is so powerful that we need to adjust the air conditioning here so that we have the pleasure of the soul. It's not to make the body an enemy or the pleasures of light an enemy. They have their importance. We shouldn't go to war over these things. We have tried that many times before in many centuries. Our proposal moving forward is to bring these things together, the things of earth and of the spiritual realm, of the spirits who find ways to find fulfillment. And Joanna de Angelis talks a lot about the psychological proposal that the Christ has brought us, in which courage has stopped being violence and aggression. It became love, and it stopped being passive, but being proactive. These are virtues without losing ourselves, are still natural in our lives. But all this confusion is momentary. Michelle, Alexander, what do you think about us opening to people so they can bring some questions to us? Even because people might be suffering by this point in time.
Okay.
We have a first question. Fabrício is going to read the questions in Portuguese and in English. So, do medical or psychiatric interventions for a person who is physically or mentally ill cause a delay in obtaining the spiritual benefits that can come from the person's suffering? The opposite. Whenever we can mitigate other people's sufferings and reduce that, we should try to. Even because that suffering, and I'll give you an example of psychiatric suffering. Sometimes it is there because of a series of experiences, whether they are from previous incarnations or whether they are traumatic experiences in this life. And that by itself, that suffering, if it cannot be worked on, if it cannot lead to growth, it will not bring a great gain. On the contrary, when that is treated or addressed, when people are able to balance reestablish their balance, they will begin to print onto themselves this ability to live this balance, and they will carry that with them later. So it's very important for us to leverage all the resources we have, whether they are medicine or psychotherapy, and if we can bring all of these together, and also a spiritual support if we can, with this perspective of spirituality, then we have a wonderful kit to help people to overcome their challenges and not create new conditions that may cause them suffering. But we should, yes, use all the tools at our disposal. They do not cause delay, on the opposite. Even because then we could become masochists. Remember the first meeting we had in which somebody asked, why did Christ say, take this cup away from me? He was ready to go through that moment, but it doesn't mean it's going to be pleasant. So that moment is also very important, even from a religiosity perspective. a lot of uh, self pain has been created through masochism. This misinterpretation has happened in Christianity, for instance, the idea of mortifying the flesh to free the spirit. Something else that is very important is that even though the pain and suffering act as evolutionary mechanisms, there is also a role for growth and reconfiguration. Let's be careful. Suffering by itself did not help the soul evolve. It's not useful. But if we have this correction that suffering brings us, which is nothing but to experience something that we otherwise had not understood until then, or we insist on not understanding. That's why we go through that experience. It would only have value if I know how to yield a gain from that, if I extract from that something to help me. Perhaps to say no is not the best way to go because it seems very intellectually that we could just click. Let's say to transform ourselves, to change ourselves because of that. That is more important. Suffering by itself doesn't help. So the anesthesia, so to speak, the self-medicating pain or a surgery, and maybe somebody who's blind came to learn something, and if they restore their eyes, maybe they won't be helpful. Well, maybe it will. How do we know? So maybe from there on, they will have a different experience, and that different experience, they'll also be filled with happiness and pain, to have a different perspective, to be able to see from now on. So we're not gods to know what is behind the suffering of each one of us. And sometimes even the enlightened spirits who sometimes know act that way. So it's very important, and it's a really good question. So, for instance, somebody who recovers from a state of depression and is able to restore their wellness through the use of medicine and psychotherapy, they can begin to see life with a very different perspective, and mature from that, and have more energy to help other people, for instance, to do good, to talk about these things. So I think that's like, sometimes suffering is so big we cannot even connect our thoughts. And as the pain lessens, it allows us to better organize ourselves. And that also can be applied to physical illnesses. If we have an illness, we should go after resources to treat them. I like to think about the example of Francis of Assisi, who faced many difficult illnesses. And at the end of his life, when he has a problem with his eyes, he accepts treatment that's available at that time, which is the burning of his eyes with a hot iron. And there is a book that tells us it's called Francis of Assisi by the Spirit Miramis. And it's a really beautiful moment when he prays to the brother fire to improve his pain. And he accepts that. And we can say, oh my goodness, the medieval age treatment, that's so painful. But he accepts, with all his spiritual grandeur, he accepts the treatment available at that time and leaves us with another example. So let us use the examples, the resources that we have to improve. Yeah, that's maybe medieval care, right? That's not maybe the best way of treating that change the pains, but that's what he had available. So we have one more question. It's more of a comment. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of expositions in a simple way about suffering. What you guys talked about reminds me of the good suffering and bad suffering in the gospel. we need experience to expand consciousness and create
olha que
clarity.
interessante isso que tu trouxe da mensagem do bem no nosso
Look at how
coração.
interesting, Deborah, you talked about suffering
Quando os
well or
espíritos
suffering
nos
poorly.
dizem que nós estamos num mundo
When we are in this world that we
provas,
call world of
expiações,
trials and
vamos
expiations,
entender
let's
essas duas
understand these two
termos, irmãos.
terms.
A
Expiation
expiação
is
uma
an experience
experiência
that I'm
que
going to
eu
go
vou
through
passar
one way or
por meio
another.
de outro. Está
It's
no
in
meu
my
caminho,
journey,
nessa vida, até
in
mesmo na
my
programação
spiritual
espiritual,
program, so to
essa
speak, to
encarnação,
go through
passar
this. It
por
has
aquilo. Tem uma
a time.
temporalidade. Eu posso
I can
passar
go through
tentando
life
lidar com
trying to
aquilo.
dealing with that.
Eu posso passar
I can
colocando fogo no
try
sangue,
to go through that
sendo
by denying and
revoltado,
rebelling
fazendo
against
algo
it, but I'm
ainda
going to
pior,
go
mas eu
through
vou
that
passar.
experience.
E já
It's
de uma
compulsory,
maneira
it's mandatory.
compulsória, há espíritos que
There are
o
spirits
grau de
who
consciência
have
tão
a
pequeno,
degree of
de
awareness
revolta,
and rebellion, the
de
awareness is so low,
intenção
and the desire to
de
revolt
imperar,
and
de
to
poder
prevail over
é
others
tão
is so
grande
big that
que
even if you
mesmo que dê
give
todas
all
as chances para ela
chances,
se
they won't
transformar, ela não
necessarily
aceita. Então
want to
vai haver
transform.
uma
So
força
life
compulsória dessas espíritos
forces
que
them to
magneticamente
magnetically
atraem
attracts them to
para o
places and
ambiente
situations
aonde
in which
essa mesma questão está sendo vivida.
challenge is
Então é
being
a chamada
lived.
expiação. Então
That's
vão
called
haver
expiations.
doenças às
For
vezes que
instance,
nós
some
vamos
illnesses
passar
sometimes that we
por
have to
uma
go through that
postura
don't have a cure for,
ou que nós não
or we don't
sabemos se
know
vai
they
ter
will have a
cura ou
cure
não,
for or
e
not,
aquilo se dá ao longo do
or
tempo.
maybe moral
Aflições
afflictions
morais que parece que nós fazemos
that
tudo que
we
está ao
try to
nosso alcance para
change
mudar
and
aquilo e
seems like
parece que não
nothing is
faz a
working.
mínima diferença.
So these are
São as
expiations.
expiações. E há um
And
outro
there's a different
tipo
kind of
de
suffering,
sofrimento
which is
também, que
these
são as
trials.
provas.
And so what's the
Qual é a
difference?
diferença das provas? As
The
provas
difference
são
is that
as
the trials are more
vítimas
subtle. They're
mais
more
elaboradas.
elaborate.
Que quer
That
dizer
is
que
to
o
say that
espírito
the
já tem
spirit
um
already
ganho
has a
nesse
certain
sentido. E ele
baggage
já
in
tem
that
uma
area
vantagem.
and a
Se ele
degree of
disser aonde
awareness
ele
in
pode
which they
fazer
can
isso, ele
choose.
ouve.
And
E
if
aí,
in the
se na
expiation
expiação o importante
it's
é
important
descarregar
to
na terra
go
a
through
lição
that
que ele
and
tem,
unload
que ele
that
tem
on
em
earth,
volta, tudo
they're going
bem.
to
Pode
live through
viver
that
isso, só
until
quer
they're
gastar.
spent,
E até
until they can
voltar
feel
arrependido com as
their
forças
energy
gastas e
spent
aí
and try to
querer
change
buscar.
themselves.
Essa é a expiação.
Now, in the
E a
trials,
prova
it's
é
for the
também
learning.
um aprendizado. Então,
Not that
não
our
os
spiritual
mergulhamos
mentors
nessa
think that
prova,
way,
mas vamos imaginar aqui.
but
Vamos colocá-lo
it's
à
a
prova.
test, so to
Vamos
speak.
ver se
Let's see
agora,
if
numa
during
prova
that
como essa, a
experience,
pessoa vai
they will be
conseguir
able to live that
exemplificar o que
which
vem
they have been
construindo
building in the
no mundo
spiritual realm
espiritual
or
ao
in
longo
other
das outras
lives.
vidas.
So in the
Então, se na
expiation, it's
expiação,
about how we
como nós
go
vamos
through
passar a
it
expiação,
and what
o
kind
que
of
tem
psychological
se tornando
climate,
mais
whether we are
claro,
rebellious or
menos,
not, whether we're going to
quem é
create
que
more
vai
debt or
sabermos
not.
quando a gente diz
Look at
assim,
what I'm
olha,
going
eu
through.
estou
Nobody knows
passando,
what I'm
ninguém
going
sabe o que
through.
eu estou passando.
I used to have a
Eu tenho um
very
amigo
dear
muito
friend,
querido
and he
que
had a really
ele tinha uma
difficult
doença muito
illness.
difícil
Nobody
e ele dizia
knows
assim,
through what
ninguém
I
sabe o
come
que eu
and he
passo. E daí
go
ele era
through, and he was
revoltado
very
e gastava
rebellious
todo mundo.
towards everybody.
E em outra vida
And
ele
in a
era assim
previous life,
muito
he was like that,
bonitão.
and he did not
Em
have
outra vida ele
the
tinha um corpão
illness.
bem bonitão, né?
He had a beautiful
Em determinado trabalho que ele fez,
life
foi
in a
aparecendo
previous
que ele era bem
life. And
franzino,
during
né?
a
Uma
spiritual
doença
session, we
longa,
learned
profunda,
that
mas ainda era um
he was
alemão
very healthy in a
bem
previous life, and he
forte,
brought his
né? E já
fury
fazia
with
essa
him.
fúria.
So his
Então,
rebellion
porque a
came
revolta era
from
anterior
before
ao
to what he
chamado da
thought was the
causa.
cause. So it's about
Então,
how we're
já
going to
nós vamos
live
passar
through
essa
things,
expiação.
expiation.
Já a prova,
The
então,
trial,
é
however, is about what kind of
escolhas que eu
choices
posso
I'm going to
fazer, como é que eu vou tentar
have
remediar. E
to be
aí
able
eu
to
vejo que essas
remediate or
escolhas
mitigate
jamais
those
vão ter um
challenges.
remédio para aquilo que nós passamos.
These
Às
two
vezes tem a ver com o bem ou mal que
have
nós
to do
fizemos,
with
né?
the
Como nós
goodness
vamos passar
or
por
the
aquilo.
evil that we have created.
Então, vejamos daqui a pouco os nossos
So, for
amigos
instance,
que
we can
estão em
see our
países
friends
em
who are
guerra,
in
né?
wars and
Há
countries
alguns
where
que
there are
podem
wars.
solucionar
Some
aquilo.
countries can solve that,
Mas será que todos podem ter
but
essa,
can
essa
all of them
solução?
have this solution?
Daqui a pouco
And
a gente
sometimes
vai
it's
estar com
hard
muita
for us
visão, muitos vão
to
passar
see
de uma
that all of
vida
them
para
can.
outra.
And so
Será
during
que
this
nessa
war,
guerra,
they're
sofrendo coisas que
suffering
talvez
things
até
that
escapem
may
da
be
nossa
impossible for
visão,
us
talvez
to
até escapem para
understand.
nós como que deve ser
It's
isso,
so
né?
distant from our
Muito
reality.
distante da nossa realidade.
Will
Será que eles vão
they
passar
go
aquilo
through that by
criando mais
creating more
guerras?
debts, or will
Ou
they,
eles vão
through
também,
that
né, mesmo no seu
suffering,
sofrimento,
fear,
no
and through pain,
medo, na dor, estar
be
ali, meu Deus, como é que
reflective
eu
about
posso, né,
how do
ajudar as
they
pessoas que estão à minha volta
improve the
aqui?
situation, how they
Como é que
help
eu lido
people
com
around
isso,
them,
né?
how do
Como
they
é que eu
go through
passo
this
por essa
experience.
experiência? Há
There's
uma
so many
multiplicidade de
answers
respostas
that
que devem
that
ser
they can find in
encontradas
that
nesse
moment.
momento, né? Lembrando que
recalling that even in these difficult moments, in whichever side of the battlefield they're in, they're going through a very intense experience, and that little by little over many centuries, we will free ourselves from that with greater or less
tudo a ver com o
learning.
mal sofrer, nós lembrarmos,
So
né,
the
da
good
alegoria da
suffering and
prova
bad
e
suffering
das
kind of reminds us
expiações.
of this idea of trials and expiations.
Alexandre, Michele, obrigado.
Alexander,
Estamos
Michelle, thank you very
chegando
much. We
já
are
no
reaching the
finalzinho
end
do nosso
of our
encontro.
meeting.
Vocês gostariam
Would
de
you
fazer
like to do any
uma
final
mensagem final
comments
para fazer o
so that we can
encerramento do
wrap things
estudo?
up?
Eu acho que cabe a
So I think
gente
it's important for us to
compartilhar
share some
algumas coisas
things
que a Joana de
that
Ângeles
Joanna de
define,
Angelis
assim. Ela
defines.
diz que a
She says that happiness
felicidade é
is to be
estar de bem
well with
consigo
oneself,
mesmo e estar de
aligned
acordo
with
com
the
as leis de
divine
Deus.
laws, and that
Que o
suffering
sofrimento
is the
é um
unbalance of the
desequilíbrio da
soul
alma que se identifica
that
com
identifies
o
with that which
impermanente,
is
aquilo que não
impermanent, that which
permanece,
is
aquilo que
transitory,
passa,
that is
aquilo que
which
é da
belongs to matter,
matéria.
attachment to
E o que são
material
as
things.
coisas
And what are the
permanentes?
permanent
O
things?
espírito, a
It's the
mente,
spirit, the
o
mind,
amor. E
values.
o que são as coisas
And what are impermanent things?
impermanentes?
Matter,
A
transitory
matéria, as coisas
things,
que
the
não têm
physical
posse,
body,
o corpo
death,
físico, a morte,
these things that don't
nada
belong to
nos
us.
pertencem. Então, a
So,
impermanência
impermanence
de
of all
todas as
things and
coisas
people
e
in the physical
pessoas no
world
mundo físico também se
also
relaciona
has to
com
deal with
essas
suffering.
questões do sofrimento, né? E uma
And the
aceitação do
acceptance
sofrimento é
of
um passo
that
decisivo
suffering is an important
para a
step in our
libertação também,
liberation.
enquanto a
And
rebeldia
rebellion
produz uma
oftentimes
rebeldia
has the opposite
contrária.
effect.
Então, acho
And
que
so,
isso é uma
this is a
mensagem
message
que a
I
gente
would like
pode
to leave you
deixar
with
e
and
mais uma vez
highlight
enfatizando o quanto
how
os espíritos
unanimous
são
the spirits
unânimes
are
em reafirmar o
and
que diz o
reaffirming the
ensinamento de
teachings of the
Cristo,
Christ that
de que
love
o amor
is a
é um
possible
caminho
way
possível
for
de
us to
superação de
overcome
todas as
all our
dores e
pain and
sofrimentos
sufferings and to
e da
building
construção de
a
um
healthier
futuro cada vez
future.
mais sadio.
E que bom, né, meus
And
amigos?
friends,
Claro que o nosso encontro de hoje
of
está
course, our
muito
meeting
longe
today
de chegar a uma
was very
palavra
far away
final
from having a final
para
word
entender
on the
o que
topic
Joana
of
e Kardec
understanding
nos
what
traz
Kardec and
sobre
Joanna brings
sofrimento
to us
e
when it comes to
plenitude,
suffering,
a
plenitude, and
felicidade,
happiness.
né? Mas compreendendo talvez um
But
pouco
perhaps we
melhor
can
uma
understand
compreensão que os
better
espíritos
this
trazem, na
idea that the
Terra não
spirits bring
existe
that on
felicidade
earth we don't
plena.
have
Ela é
pure
relativa.
happiness.
Claro que não
Of
quer dizer
course,
que
we
ela
have
seja
relative
perfeita, como
happiness, and
todos
that's
nós
very
queremos que seja,
important.
pelo amor de Deus, né, meus amigos?
But this happiness is
Mas ela é
relative,
relativa.
and this
E a
full
felicidade plena
happiness can be
está no
found
espírito
in the
que
spirit who
evoluiu,
has
não
evolved, and that doesn't
está
take place
aqui
here
na
on
Terra.
earth yet.
E compreender essa
And to
questão da
understand this question
impermanência
of
que Michel
impermanence that
traz, né?
Michelle
Para que a gente
brought
até
to
possa
us,
fazer as
so that we
pazes com as
make
questões
peace
do
with the
mundo.
world.
Claro que todo mundo quer
Of
estar bem,
course, everybody wants to
protegido,
feel
como assim se
great.
diz.
They
Todo
feel
mundo quer ser
loved and
amado, todo
understood.
mundo quer ser compreendido. E
And
muitas
many
vezes nós nos
times we
identificamos
identify
com
with
pessoas que
people
são tão
who are
belas,
beautiful, have
tão
beautiful
bonitas,
bodies,
né?
and
E
in
alguns
fact
realmente
they
são
are
lindos
beautiful in
de
their
alma,
souls, but
outros,
sometimes they are
muito pelo
not.
contrário.
As the medium
Xavier
Francis
dizia
Xavier will
que às
say,
vezes
sometimes
surpreendia
he'll be surprised
verdadeiras
by
beldades,
men and women
lindas
who are so
mulheres muito
beautiful in the
bonitas,
physical
mas
world,
que no mundo
but
espiritual
spiritually
a sua
their vibration
vibração
was
era
horrible,
horrenda, pareciam
even
até
seeming like
bruxas, como ele diz
monsters
assim,
or
né?
witches in a
Num
symbolism that he would
simbolismo, né? Numa
jokingly
imagem,
use.
né? Semelhante que é como se fosse, né? Para
Such
alguns
was
a
the
forma horrenda das
spiritual
suas
vibrations that
vibrações e
came
das
from
suas
them.
emoções. Então, se é muito bom daqui
It
a
would be
pouco
very
nós
great for us to
admirarmos
admire
uma pessoa
somebody
famosa,
who has a
fazendo
beautiful
fotos com
body,
o
who's
véu, né?
famous. That is
Dizendo
nice.
assim, que bonito, né?
But let's
Mas
also
temos que admirar.
admire
E temos que há
something that
algo
is
que é
even more
mais interessante
beautiful,
que a
the
beleza da
beauty of the
alma.
soul.
Porque, claro, para a beleza do corpo,
Because the
existem
beauty
duas
of
forças
the
muito grandes:
body
o
will be
tempo
affected by the
e
law
a
of gravity and
letalidade.
time.
Com o tempo e com a
Gravity and
letalidade do
time
planeta,
will change
tudo
everything.
muda, tudo transforma.
But
E
fortunately,
graças a Deus,
the spirits have come to
podemos
talk
falar da
to us
beleza da
about the
alma.
beauty
E
of
me
the
senti
soul,
redimido, porque eu posso buscar aonde é possível, né?
and
Porque
that's
vai
where we should
chegando uma
focus.
hora que o cremezinho,
Because at one point in
o
time, the cream, the
botox, o
Botox,
cuidado do
the
cabelo, que é
the hair,
necessário, tá, meus amigos? É
and all this is
necessário, pelo amor
important.
de Deus, a
It's
gente tem
important
que
for us to
ter
take care
um
of ourselves,
autocuidado,
a
um
love for self. There's
amorzinho
nothing
por si
wrong with
mesmo, não
that.
tem problema nenhum.
But comes a
Mas chega
time
uma
when
hora
that
que
is
isso não é
enough.
suficiente.
And
Mas aí
that is when the
os
resources of the
recursos da
soul
alma, meus amigos,
come in, and
esses são
those are
infinitos. Olha só que
infinite.
interessante, né?
Those
Esses
are
são
infinite, the
infinitos
beauty of the
na
soul.
beleza da alma.
And that is
Isso
what's
é o
most
que é mais
interesting and more
interessante, é o
liberating.
que é mais libertador.
So I'm
Então,
really
assim, é uma
happy to
grande
be with all
alegria
of
estar
you.
aqui com todos e espero que possam aí usar
And I hope that
esses
you may
conhecimentos que aqui a gente
leverage
pôde
these
buscar
these
no
insights that Kardec and the
hoje
Angelis
e
bring to
seguir
us,
aí
so that you may
motivados nos
feel
estudos com
energized to
todos os
continue to
seus.
study the topic. So we want to thank Michelle and Alexander for the opportunity for our time here together. I also want to thank everybody who's here with us. So thank you for your presence and say goodbye.